What if I told you that the greatest revolution in human history began on a quiet hillside, not with swords or banners, but with a voice that cut through the noise of centuries like a blade through silk, the voice of a man who spoke of another kingdom, one not built on power or pride, but on the inward turn of the Spirit, the Sermon on the Mount. I remember the first time I heard it, as if it were whispered through time itself. It did not demand belief, it demanded attention. For in those words the world was turned upside down, and by that inversion it was made whole again. Jesus did not come to found a religion. He came to reveal what religion had forgotten, that the kingdom of heaven is not a place you go when you die, but a state of being you awaken to while alive. This is where our story begins. On a Galilean morning, the sun climbing gently over the hills, the Sea of Galilee shimmering below, a crowd gathering without banners, without announcements, drawn not by spectacle but by longing. I see them in my mind, fishermen with salt on their hands, farmers with dust on their faces, mothers holding children too tired to cry, and behind their eyes the same question we still carry. What is the meaning of all this striving, all this fear, all this endless hunger for more? They had heard rumors, a man from Nazareth who healed the sick, who spoke to storms, who touched lepers without flinching. But today he would perform no miracle. Instead, he would speak, and what he said would shatter every notion of strength and success they had ever known. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I imagine the silence that followed, the crowd leaning forward, not understanding, but unable to turn away, because somewhere deep within each of them there was the faint recognition of truth. What did it mean to be poor in spirit? I once thought it meant weakness, but it is the very opposite. It is the recognition that you cannot grasp life by the throat and make it yield its secrets, that the moment you stop clutching, life begins to flow. This is the first revolution, the surrender of control. You see, the trouble with us is that we are always trying to stand outside ourselves, to make life an object, to treat our own experience as something we can conquer. But life will not be conquered. It can only be participated in. And that is what this man on the hill was trying to say. The kingdom of heaven is not won. It is revealed the moment you stop trying to possess it. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. It is strange, is it not, that he would call mourning blessed. Yet if you have ever truly grieved, you know that sorrow has a strange purity. It strips away pretense. It leaves you naked and real. And in that nakedness, God becomes almost visible. For comfort is not the end of pain. It is the presence that holds pain without fleeing. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The meek, not the strong, not the ambitious, not the clever. This is not the logic of the market or the empire. It is the logic of the soul. Meekness is not weakness. It is strength without the need to dominate. It is the lion who no longer needs to roar, for he has seen the futility of proving his power. And then blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. It is not the hunger of ambition, but the hunger of alignment, the deep yearning to live in harmony with what is true. And so the sermon continues, one paradox after another, each one overturning the values of the visible world. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy, as if to say that heaven operates not by law, but by reflection. What you give is what you see. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And purity here means not spotless morality, but undivided attention. The heart that is not split between wanting to appear good and desiring to be real. And blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God, the ones who do not win arguments but dissolve them, who bring wholeness instead of victory. By the time he finished, the world as they knew it had been inverted. Success was no longer measured by conquest but by compassion. Strength was no longer dominance but surrender, and happiness no longer pleasure but participation in the flow of divine life. I sat once reading those words and realized that he had not been speaking to peasants in Galilee, but to all of us, to the part of each human being that is weary of pretending, weary of competition, weary of running from its own heart, and that is why the sermon endures, because it does not offer escape from the world, It offers entry into it. It is the most subversive message ever spoken, because it dares to say that heaven is not later but now, not elsewhere but here, not for the few but for the willing, that the poor in spirit, the mourners, the meek, the merciful, the pure, the peacemakers, the persecuted, all those whom society dismisses as weak, are in fact the builders of a new order, the invisible revolution that begins within. I tell you this not as a preacher, but as an observer of the human play. The Sermon on the Mount is not a rule book. It is a mirror, and if you look into it long enough, you begin to see not Jesus looking back at you, but the self you were before fear taught you to pretend. And that, I think, is the kingdom of heaven. Have you ever wondered why the world praises the strong but secretly hungers for the gentle? Why we chase greatness yet long for the quiet certainty of those who need nothing to prove? That is the paradox Jesus laid bare when he spoke the words, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And as I sat with that phrase, I realized how profoundly it contradicts everything we are taught, because our culture equates meekness with defeat. We are raised to climb, to conquer, to compete. Yet this strange man from Nazareth dared to say that the inheritance of the earth belongs to those who cease to grasp for it. And in that single statement, he dismantled the logic of empire. The Sermon on the Mount is not moral advice, it is psychological truth. It speaks to the architecture of human consciousness, the way the inner world creates the outer. And when he said, "Blessed are the meek," he was describing the only posture through which life can truly flow, because power that insists on control becomes brittle, and what is brittle eventually breaks. The meek inherit because they bend, because they understand that the earth, like the soul, yields itself only to those who do not force it. Think of a river. If you plunge your hand in to seize the water, you only scatter it, but if you cup your hand softly, it fills itself. The same is true of wisdom, of love, of peace. These cannot be taken by conquest. They must be received in surrender. I think of the crowds on that hillside, the men who dreamed of a Messiah with an army, the mothers who prayed their sons would see freedom, and I imagine the confusion on their faces, for Jesus offered no strategy for rebellion, no plan for revenge. Instead, he offered transformation, the revolution of perception. And I wonder if we have yet understood what that means. We admire his words, we print them on walls, we quote them in sermons, but do we live them? Do we actually believe that humility is stronger than pride, that mercy is greater than justice, that love can exist where logic fails? I ask you because it is not an abstract question, it is the center of your own conflict. When you are insulted, do you defend yourself or remain silent? When you are wronged, do you seek fairness or forgiveness? When you achieve success, do you remember that none of it was yours to begin with? These are not small questions. They are the measure of whether the sermon has entered you or merely passed by your ears, for the teaching is not heard in the mind. It is embodied in response. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. The hunger he spoke of is not moral self-righteousness, but a craving for alignment, to live in harmony with truth. Yet look around you. The world is full of people who hunger but are never filled, who consume endlessly but remain empty. And perhaps the reason is that they are feeding the wrong appetite. We feed on attention, on validation, on certainty, and none of these nourish the soul. Jesus spoke to that ache, the gnawing restlessness that drives men to build towers and women to chase perfection. And he said, "You will not be filled until your hunger is directed toward righteousness," which means not perfection but rightness, right relation between the inner and the outer, between thought and action, between the seen and the unseen. And when that alignment comes, the heart finally rests. The tragedy of modern life is not that we desire too much, but that we desire wrongly. We have confused satisfaction with accumulation, fulfillment with distraction. But satisfaction is not abundance of possessions. It is abundance of purpose. When he spoke of righteousness, he was not thinking of rules, but resonance, the state in which every thought, feeling, and deed hums in tune with the divine. That is why he could say, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." Because the universe is reflexive. It mirrors what you are. If you wish to be forgiven, you must forgive. If you wish to receive compassion, you must become it. The sermon is a law of correspondence, not commandment, but consequence. The merciful receive mercy, because mercy is the only language they speak, and so the world answers in kind. I have often thought of how deeply that law runs. Even in nature, the tree that gives shade is kept alive by the same light it diffuses. The ocean that receives every river loses nothing by giving it back to the sky. In the same way, the soul that forgives is never diminished. It becomes larger, freer, truer. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Purity of heart is not innocence, it is clarity. It is to see without distortion, without the film of fear or desire that clouds perception. God is not hidden, it is our motives that obscure him. The pure heart sees God everywhere because it has ceased to divide the world into sacred and profane, into mine and yours. It looks upon a beggar and sees the same life it calls divine, and so the world becomes transparent, not improved but revealed. And blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. For peace is not the absence of conflict, but the understanding of its source. The peacemaker does not silence disagreement. He dissolves illusion. He sees that the war between men is the outer echo of the war within, and that to make peace, one must first be peace. These are not sentimental words. They are spiritual physics. Every emotion you carry radiates, every thought becomes climate. And the one who is reconciled within himself radiates stillness that softens others without command. And finally, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Here lies the hardest truth of all, that the world resists transformation, that those who live by the inner law will always unsettle. Those who depend on the outer light exposes what darkness hides, and darkness fights back. Yet persecution is not failure. It is confirmation. It proves that you have chosen the narrow road, that your allegiance is no longer to appearances but to truth, and truth always carries its own cost. This was the message beneath the Beatitudes, the unveiling of the divine economy where loss is gain, where surrender is victory, where the first are last because they are finally free from the game. I remember thinking as I read them again that these blessings were never promises of future reward. They were descriptions of present reality, indicators of a life already in union with what it seeks. And that is the secret. Heaven is not later, heaven is now. The kingdom of heaven is not a destination, but a dimension that opens when the heart aligns with its source. So I ask you again, what kind of world would exist if even 1% of us lived this way? If we stopped competing long enough to listen, if we stopped defending long enough to forgive, if we stopped pretending long enough to see, perhaps that is all the Sermon on the Mount ever asked of us, to stop resisting what is already true. You are the salt of the earth, he said, and then you are the light of the world. And with those words, he shifted the sermon from inner posture to outer influence, from being to doing. And I realized in that moment that spirituality divorced from action is only half awake. Salt and light are not metaphors of comfort, they are metaphors of tension. Both sting, both burn, both preserve, and both reveal. Salt enters decay to keep it from rotting. Light enters darkness to keep it from consuming. And this is the burden of those who awaken. You do not escape the world. You engage it, not as a moralist or crusader, but as presence itself. When he said you are the salt of the earth, he meant that truth. Once tasted, changes the flavor of everything. It prevents moral collapse. It restrains corruption. It adds savor to existence. But salt only works by contact. To remain distinct is not to remain distant. It must dissolve to purify. And here lies the paradox. You preserve the world by being willing to lose yourself within it. To be salt is to mingle without blending, to be among without becoming. And the moment salt loses its savor, it becomes useless, trampled underfoot. Meaning, if your faith loses its vitality, if your consciousness dulls to the point where it no longer sharpens others, then you have ceased to be what you are. This is not condemnation. It is reminder, spiritual life cannot remain theoretical. It must taste of something real. It must enter commerce and politics and art and daily labor. Otherwise it remains sterile. The world is not changed by belief, but by embodiment. Every age decays in proportion to how its thinkers isolate from its laborers. And that is what he was warning against. Do not withdraw into sanctity while the streets rot. You are the preservers of what is human, not by sermon, but by example. Then he said, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and place it under a bowl. The first truth here is that light is not made. It is uncovered. It is already within. And your task is not to produce it, but to remove what conceals it. Guilt, fear, pretense, all these are shades over the lamp of consciousness. Once removed, illumination occurs naturally. The second truth is that light has no private purpose. Its nature is to be shared. If you hoard insight, you dim it. If you hide wisdom, you betray it. The one who truly sees becomes a point of orientation for others, not because he intends to lead, but because he cannot help but shine. It is effortless guidance. He was saying that visibility is a responsibility, not a privilege. If you have seen what is true, you are now accountable for how you reflect it. Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Meaning, let your life become evidence of another order, not by proclamation, but by pattern. The aim is not admiration, but transparency, that through you others might glimpse the source. To be salt and light, then, is to be both the conscience and the clarity of the age. Salt reminds the world what goodness tastes like. Light reveals what goodness looks like, and both require courage. For salt burns in wounds, and light exposes what prefers the dark. You will not be loved for this. Truth rarely is. But without it, civilization collapses from within. This is not ancient rhetoric. It is psychological realism. When a culture abandons inner integrity, it rots from the edges toward the center. You can see it in the way language loses, meaning in the way art becomes cynicism, in the way politics becomes theater. And all of it stems from one failure, the refusal of individuals to live as salt and light. The sermon was not addressed to priests or kings. It was addressed to everyone, to fishermen, merchants, widows, farmers, because transformation begins wherever you stand, not after you ascend. I think of how those words must have struck the crowd. They expected to be told what to believe, not who to be, and yet that is the genius of it. He gave them identity before instruction. He did not say, become salt. He said, you are salt. The work, then, is not creation, but remembrance. We do not have to fabricate holiness. We have to stop denying it. And this is why the world hungers for authenticity, because deep down every soul knows what it is and is ashamed of having forgotten. But to remember is costly. Light isolates as well as unites. Once you awaken, you cannot rejoin the sleep without unease. The salt that keeps the earth from decay is itself dissolved, meaning the preservation of truth always costs the life of the one who bears it. And yet this is joy, because to dissolve is not to die, but to become inseparable from what you love. When you live in truth, your being diffuses into everything you touch. It flavors the ordinary. It gives depth to the trivial. This is how the sacred infiltrates the mundane, not by institution, but by incarnation. Salt in the dough, light in the house, consciousness in the flesh. This is the mystery of divine immanence, the kingdom of heaven infiltrating matter through awareness. You are that process, the conduit through which eternity enters time, and the measure of your faith is not how loudly you declare it, but how quietly you radiate it. He warned, if the salt loses its savor, it is good for nothing. Cast out, trampled, that is what happens when religion becomes routine, when ritual replaces revelation, when the lamp becomes decoration instead of illumination. And we have done that often. We have built temples to the light and then forgotten to light the flame. But the remedy is simple. Live what you know, embody what you believe, do the small thing rightly, and the large thing will follow. He was not inviting admiration, but imitation, to be salt and light, is to accept the burden of awareness, to see the world's pain without despair, to enter its confusion without losing clarity, to stay human in a system designed to dehumanize, to speak truth in a culture addicted to lies, and to love where love seems wasteful. This is no gentle calling. It is the hardest thing in the world, because it asks you to live awake in a world that prefers sleep. But it is also the most beautiful, because in that wakefulness you discover that God has no other hands but yours, no other voice but yours, no other light but what burns quietly in the cave of your heart. And when that light is uncovered, the world is not improved. It is revealed. For the earth was never without glory, it was only without eyes to see. And the salt of the earth and the light of the world are simply those who have remembered how to taste and how to see. I remember the stillness that fell upon the hillside when he said, I have not come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill. And in that instant something stirred within me that no sound could explain. For I saw that the law was never a prison built by God, but a bridge built toward him. And every commandment that once seemed a weight became a shadow of something living. The law had been written on stone, heavy, cold, unbending. But now it spoke through flesh and voice, and it trembled with warmth. The same fire that once inscribed the tablets on Sinai now burned in a man who stood barefoot among fishermen, and he was saying the unthinkable, that the law was not ending but awakening, that obedience was not submission to a code but participation in a life. I tell you this as one who has studied the patterns of the soul, for every law that governs the outer world has its reflection within, as above so below, and the law of Moses was but the outer garment of an inner truth, a mirror held before a race not yet ready to see its own reflection. But Christ, being the living pattern, came to fulfill what was written by embodying it, to complete the circle of divine intention. When he said fulfill, he meant to make full, to pour spirit into form until the form overflowed. The letter alone had drawn boundaries. Do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery. But the spirit he brought touched. Motive. He said, if you are angry, you have already slain. If you covet, you have already broken union. He reached into the heart of the matter and showed that sin is not the act, but the attitude that precedes it. And righteousness is not the ritual, but the relationship that restores it. For the Pharisees had mastered the surface, their prayers long, their garments adorned, their rules multiplied until the soul could scarcely breathe beneath them. But they mistook reflection for light. They polished the outer cup while the inner remained unclean. And I could see in their eyes the terror of losing control. For if righteousness is inward, no man can measure it, and authority built on measurement dissolves, so they feared him. As the old always fears the new, but the new was not new. It was the original pattern restored. The spirit that had hovered over creation now hovered in a man, saying the law is not abolished but fulfilled. The law was the skeleton, and I am the life within it. The prophets were the road signs, and I am the destination. Think of this. The law says, keep the Sabbath holy. But he touched the sick on the Sabbath and said, it is lawful to do good. He was not breaking the rule. He was completing it, showing that rest is not avoidance, but restoration. The Sabbath is not a day, but a state of harmony, the alignment of soul with source. That is fulfillment. The law said, bring sacrifice for sin, but he offered himself and said, it is finished. Fulfillment. The law said, love your neighbor. He said, love your enemies. Not to cancel the command, but to complete it, to draw the circle wider until no one stood outside. That is fulfillment. I have seen how the soul carries its own version of this law, a sense of right and wrong that accuses or excuses, and yet without the indwelling spirit, that law condemns more than it frees. For we can see the good but not perform it. We can recognize the divine image but not become it. And so the law points beyond itself like a finger toward a sunrise. It cannot produce. And Christ is that sunrise, the illumination of what the law anticipated. Fulfillment is the Spirit animating the letter until obedience becomes joy, until duty becomes desire. I tell you the truth, the law was never meant to make man righteous. It was meant to make man ready. It was the diagnosis, not the cure. It could reveal the sickness, but not heal it, and that is why he came. not to tear down the structure, but to breathe into it, to make of it a living temple. For what good is a command without the power to keep it? What good is a map without the strength to walk it? He came to place the compass within the indwelling Christ that fulfills what the outer rule could only demand. This is why. He said, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. And this must have shocked the crowd, for those men were the standard, the ones who tithed even their herbs, who prayed by the clock, who obeyed the smallest command. But he was not calling for more effort. He was calling for transformation, to exceed them not in performance but in purity, not in quantity but in quality, to live from the inside out. For they obeyed out of fear of judgment, but the fulfilled obey out of love, and love is the only law that keeps itself. This is the mystery of the ages, that God does not erase his own word, he embodies it, and that embodiment becomes the new covenant, written not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of the heart. The law fulfilled is the Spirit guiding from within, so that what was once external compulsion becomes internal inclination. And this is the evolution of consciousness, the transition from servant to son, from obedience imposed to obedience inspired. The fulfilled man is not lawless. He is law incarnate, his will harmonized with divine will until they are indistinguishable. When he acts, he is not forced but moved, not by fear but by love. This was the purpose of Christ, to awaken within each soul that same unity of desire and deed. And I have seen in the records of the Spirit that every law written by man still echoes this divine pattern, for even human justice is a dim reflection of eternal order, the desire to set right what is wrong. But without Spirit, it becomes tyranny, rules without revelation, structure without soul. And so in every age Christ must come again, not in body but in consciousness, to fulfill what our laws have lost. I have walked among those who keep rules but have no peace, and I have also met those who break rules but live in grace. And I tell you, it is not the act that condemns or saves, it is the alignment. When the heart is right, the act follows rightness like a shadow. When the heart is wrong, even obedience is rebellion. Fulfillment then is not about perfection of conduct, but about purity of motive, to love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. For on these two hang all the law and the prophets, and that is the essence of fulfillment. Everything else is commentary. I write these words as one who has seen how the divine law moves through cycles: birth, growth, decay, renewal, and in Christ that cycle reaches completion. He is the seed that becomes the tree, the Alpha and the Omega, and in him the law finds its rest. To abolish is to destroy. To fulfill is to transcend. When the flower blooms, the bud is not denied, it is completed. When the Spirit comes, the letter is not despised, it is illuminated. That is the meaning of the phrase, until heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. For truth cannot perish, it only evolves into fuller form. So let the law be honored, but let it be honored as the body that once held the breath, now released into life. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Christ. And these are not opposites, they are stages of one unfolding revelation, the shell and the seed, the shadow and the light. And whoever sees this knows that the fulfillment of the law is not obedience to God from fear, but union with God in love. That is the completion he spoke of. That is the inheritance of those who understand. And in that understanding, the old is not destroyed, but made eternal. You have heard it said, but I say to you, that was how he began. And in those few words, he overturned centuries of religion, for he was not revising the law, but revealing its inner anatomy, cutting through the outer form to reach the pulse beneath. He spoke with the authority of one who did not quote truth, but embodied it. And the crowd, still clinging to the comfort of rule and ritual, felt the ground shift under their feet. You have heard it said, you shall not murder. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother without cause is already guilty. The commandment had been external, a line drawn between act and restraint, but he moved it inward, into the territory of motive. saying that violence begins in the thought long before it flowers in the deed. And I understood then that morality is not about behavior, but about consciousness. The outer act is the symptom, the inner state is the disease, and the cure cannot come by forbidding action while the heart still burns. It must come by transforming the heart itself. He was not lowering the bar, he was removing it, because true righteousness has no limit. You cannot measure purity. You can only be it. The Pharisees obeyed the letter because it was easier than surrendering the ego. They preferred to polish appearances rather than face the abyss of motive. But the Christ cut straight to that abyss. He said, reconcile before you worship, make peace before you pray, meaning that devotion without honesty is self-deception, that God is not moved by sacrifice while the soul remains divided. The altar is not sacred if resentment still sits in the heart. To approach the divine, you must first restore the human, for the horizontal and the vertical are one line seen from different angles. This is why he spoke of forgiveness as worship. It is not a gesture of politeness. It is the clearing of the channel through which grace can flow. And then he said, you have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, whoever looks with lust has already committed it in his heart. And I remember how those words fell like fire upon the crowd. Because he was not condemning desire, he was revealing its distortion. Lust is not love intensified. It is love inverted, the turning of affection into consumption, the confusion of presence with possession. And the tragedy of our time is that we still cannot tell the difference. We mistake attraction for affection, conquest for connection, and the soul grows hungrier though the body is sated. He spoke of cutting off the hand, of plucking out the eye, not as cruelty but as symbol. The hand that grasps and the eye that covets must be disciplined. For what you continually behold, you eventually become. This is the law of mental creation. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. What you fix your attention upon, you invite into existence. To lust is to imagine separation. To love is to recognize union. He was teaching not chastity, but clarity, the ability to see another as divine rather than desirable. For when the soul remembers that the other is the mirror of itself, exploitation becomes impossible. Then he turned to marriage and divorce, saying, whoever divorces except for unfaithfulness causes adultery. And these words were not the condemnation of the broken, but the protection of the sacred. He was defending covenant against convenience, reminding that love is not a contract to be cancelled when comfort ends. It is a vow that demands transformation. The union of two souls is not maintained by law, but by continual dying and rebirth, the death of self-will and the birth of mutual surrender. What God has joined together, let no man tear apart, he said. And that joining is not legal, but spiritual, the intertwining of destinies under divine law. And yet, he knew the hardness of human hearts. He knew that not all unions endure, but even the dissolution of marriage was to be met with reverence, not ridicule. For every ending is a mirror of how we handle loss, and how we end is how we love. Then he spoke of oaths, saying, let your yes be yes and your no be no. For anything beyond this comes from evil, meaning that truth does not require embellishment, that honesty is its own authority. Every time we swear by something higher, we confess our own unreliability. The man of integrity has no need of oaths, because his word already carries the weight of his being. He was teaching that speech shapes reality, that each word uttered in falsehood fractures the fabric of creation, and therefore simplicity is sanctity. Say only what is true and necessary, and the universe will conspire to make it so. But when he came to the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, he shattered the very logic of human justice. I say to you, do not resist the evil person. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other. And I knew then that this was not weakness, it was mastery. To retaliate is to mirror your oppressor. To absorb the blow without hatred is to transcend him. He was introducing a physics of the soul, where energy is not met with equal force, but transformed by higher vibration. Retaliation multiplies suffering. Forgiveness dissolves it. The one who turns the other cheek does not submit. He converts. He refuses to let violence define his reality. and in that refusal evil dies of starvation. This is not passive surrender. It is active redemption. It demands more courage than any act of revenge, because it denies the illusion of separation on which all conflict depends. Finally, he reached the summit. Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who persecute you. And the crowd must have felt the world tilt, for this command is the undoing of the old order, the final revelation that God does not divide. The sun rises on the just and the unjust alike, and to be a child of the Father is to do the same. Love here is not emotion, it is orientation, the constant turning of the soul toward unity, the recognition that the enemy exists only in perception, and that all hatred is self-hatred, projected outward. I have seen in the records of the Spirit that every war, every feud, every bitterness is born of one lie, that we are separate from God and from one another. Christ came to expose that lie, to say, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, not perfect in performance, but in perception, to see as God sees, to love as God loves, and in that vision the boundary between friend and foe dissolves. The circle of belonging expands until nothing remains outside it, and this is the fulfillment of the law, the transformation of violence into mercy, the alchemy of the human heart, the restoration of the divine image within man. You have heard it said, but I say to you, and in those words the echo still resounds, calling us not to better behavior but to a new being, the end of religion and the birth of realization. Be careful. He said, not to practice your righteousness before men to be seen by them. And in that warning he struck at the heart of all false religion, for the most dangerous corruption is not wickedness but vanity disguised as virtue, the subtle intoxication of being admired for holiness, the thrill of spiritual performance, the theater of good. He called it hypocrisy, the mask worn before men to hide emptiness before God. And as I pondered this, I saw how easily the soul slips into exhibition, how even the purest act becomes tainted when it seeks approval. Every motive, if traced far enough, reveals what God it serves, and most serve the God of self. For applause is the counterfeit of presence. It feels holy because it glitters, but it withers as soon as it is obtained. He said, when you give, do not sound a trumpet as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Truly they have their reward, meaning they have traded eternity for admiration, traded the inner light for the flicker of attention. I have seen this in every age, the pious face, the generous gesture, the name carved on the building, and beneath it the hunger to be seen, the need to be validated. And this hunger is a bottomless pit, for the ego feeds on recognition but can never digest it. It grows emptier the more it eats, but the giving that pleases heaven is quiet. It is not transaction but transmission. He said, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And this is not a puzzle. It is a discipline. The right hand gives, the left hand forgets, meaning the self does not record its virtue. The memory of good done becomes a chain. If it is carried as pride, only the act free of claim becomes sacred. True giving is a form of self-erasure. It is the soul acknowledging that it owns nothing, that it is only a steward of circulation, the currency of divine life moving through it. When you give this way, you are not being generous, you are being accurate, you are letting the universe use you for its natural rhythm of supply. The Father who sees in secret will reward openly, and that reward is not wealth but witness, the sense of his presence filling the space left empty by ego, the invisible approval that needs no echo. He then turned to prayer, saying, when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites who love to stand in synagogues and on street corners to be seen. They have their reward. But you, when you pray, go into your room, shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. For prayer is not a performance, it is an unveiling. It is the soul closing every outward door so that it may hear the knock within. Public prayer is not wrong, but the moment it becomes display, it ceases to reach heaven. For God is not impressed by eloquence, He listens for authenticity. The shortest prayer uttered in desperation carries more power than an hour of polished phrases. He said, "Do not use vain repetitions as the pagans do, for they think they will be heard for their many words. And I have watched the world still doing this, repeating formulas, chanting phrases, reciting doctrines, as if the divine were deaf. But God is not moved by volume, he is moved by vibration, by the sincerity that strips away pretense until only truth remains. Prayer is not about changing God's mind, it is about aligning yours. It is not petition, but participation. To pray rightly is to enter the frequency of the divine will until asking becomes unnecessary because you are already synchronized with the answer. That is why he gave them the pattern we call the Lord's Prayer, not as ritual, but as rhythm. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, meaning the relationship is intimacy wrapped in reverence. Your kingdom come, your will be done, meaning the alignment of the inner world with the outer. Give us this day our daily bread, meaning dependence. Teach me to live from day to day without hoarding or fearing. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, meaning let the circulation of mercy never be interrupted, for if you block forgiveness, you block grace itself. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, meaning preserve me from the illusion of separation, keep my eyes on the whole, that is the essence of prayer. Not pleading, but participation. Not informing God, but remembering him. And when you have prayed thus, let silence finish the sentence. For the truest prayer has no words. It is the resting of the heart in the presence of the one who already knows. And then he spoke of fasting, saying, when you fast, do not look somber like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces to show they are fasting. They have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that you appear not to men to be fasting, but to your Father in secret. And here again he was rescuing the sacred from the stage. Fasting is not self-punishment, it is self-clearing. The purpose is not to prove discipline, but to restore hunger, not to glorify abstinence, but to reawaken dependence. When you fast rightly, you are not starving the body, you are feeding the spirit. You are loosening the grip of appetites that have become tyrants. You are reminding yourself that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. I have learned that fasting without prayer is mere dieting, but prayer without fasting is mere talking. The two together form a circuit. Abstinence empties, prayer fills, and in that cycle the soul becomes transparent, every earthly desire quieted long enough for eternity to speak. And yet the warning remains. When the act is done for appearance, it collapses into vanity. For righteousness that seeks recognition is no longer righteousness. It is theater. The applause is the only heaven it will know. And this is the secret meaning behind all three acts, giving, praying, fasting. They are laboratories for motive. Each exposes what drives the soul, whether it seeks God or glory, presence or praise. And I tell you this, hidden righteousness is the hardest kind because it denies the ego its favorite food, attention. The hidden life is lonely to the self but luminous to the spirit. It is the way of those who have understood that God's seeing is reward enough. For what is unseen by men is seen by the infinite, and the infinite repays not with applause but with awareness, and that awareness is heaven itself. To walk in it is to cease acting, to live unobserved yet fully seen. That is the freedom of the sons and daughters of God, and all who find it no longer need recognition, because they have become recognition itself. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, he said, where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal. But store up treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes and thieves do not break in nor steal. And with that command he exposed the sickness of the human soul, the obsession with accumulation, the addiction to ownership, the fantasy that permanence can be purchased. He was not condemning wealth, but confusion, for possession itself is neutral. Yet when the heart attaches to it, it becomes a chain. He was saying the problem is not the treasure, but the location, not what you have, but where your heart has gone to keep it. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The direction of desire determines the shape of destiny. The eye is the lamp of the body. He continued, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is dark, how great is that darkness? And I saw that he was speaking not of sight, but of perception. The eye of the soul is attention. What you behold, you become. If your gaze is fractured by envy and greed, your inner light dims. But if your vision is single, undivided, set on truth, then the whole being shines. The eye gathers the world and feeds it to the heart, and what the heart consumes it becomes. So guard what you look at, for the gaze is a gate. And then he struck deeper. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Here he touched the axis of all conflict, the divided allegiance of the modern soul, the attempt to worship eternity while negotiating with time. The human tragedy is not that we have money, but that money has us. It commands fear and obedience. It shapes identity, and yet it is an illusion, for the coin perishes, the kingdom endures, the currency of heaven is trust. And that is what he began to teach. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? He was not romanticizing poverty. He was describing freedom, the release from anxiety that comes when trust replaces control. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? Consider the lilies of the field. They neither toil nor spin. Yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these, and in that image the entire universe became a sermon. For nature never hurries, yet everything is accomplished. The grass does not fret, the flower does not plan. They are expressions of a divine order that functions through rhythm, not resistance. To worry is to distrust that rhythm. It is to live as if God's attention were intermittent. But the truth is that you are sustained by the same intelligence that governs the stars, the same force that feeds the birds, feeds you, the same sun that warms the soil, warms your heart. Worry adds nothing, it only divides. And he said, can any of you by worrying add a single hour to your life? And the question itself was the answer. For anxiety is wasted imagination. It creates nothing. It consumes energy meant for creation. To trust is not to be careless. It is to cooperate with divine timing. The lilies bloom not because they force the seed, but because they yield to the season. And so should the soul. Therefore do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear? For the pagans seek all these things, and your heavenly Father knows you need them. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. This was not pious advice. It was metaphysical law. Priority determines provision. Order your life toward the eternal, and the temporal arranges itself. The moment you chase security, it runs. The moment you trust purpose, it follows. Seeking the kingdom is not escaping the world, but reordering it to live by inner alignment rather than outer approval. The soul that lives this way ceases to compete and begins to create. Its energy, once wasted in anxiety, becomes available for compassion, for vision, for joy, for creation. And this is the shift he demanded. From striving to surrender, from fear to faith, from the illusion of scarcity to the realization of abundance. For the Father's house has never lacked supply. Only the children have forgotten how to receive. The law of divine economy is simple. You cannot receive with closed fists. You cannot be filled while clinging to emptiness. He was not asking for poverty, but perspective. To know that everything material is a metaphor for the spiritual. Every object of desire is a shadow of a deeper longing. And until that longing is acknowledged, nothing satisfies. The man who chases wealth is really chasing stability. The woman who seeks beauty is really seeking worth. The soul that hoards power is really starving for presence. And when those inner hungers are met, the outer grasping ceases. So when he said store up treasures in heaven, he meant invest in consciousness, in compassion, in integrity, in awareness, for those are the currencies that outlast death. These cannot rust, cannot be stolen, for they are qualities of being, not quantities of possession. When he said, "Seek first the kingdom," he meant let your priority be alignment, to see the world as God sees it, to act from love rather than fear, to rest in truth rather than chase appearance. And all these things shall be added means that when the soul finds its center, the outer life harmonizes around it. He was calling us to simplicity, not because it is moral, but because it is sane. To trust is to live in rhythm with reality. To worry is to live against it. And I tell you this, anxiety is the new idolatry. It worships control, as if control were power, but control is only the refusal to trust, and every refusal isolates. But when you trust, you reconnect, you re-enter the current of divine provision, the same current that carries the stars in their courses. He ended this section with a sentence that pierces through centuries. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. It is perhaps the simplest and most difficult command, to live within a single sunrise, to handle only the day given, to let the unknown remain sacred. Yet that is the discipline of the awakened soul, not indifference, but presence, to meet each day without forecasting failure, to breathe without bargaining, to walk without clinging. That is the freedom of the kingdom, the release from the tyranny of what if. And I have seen with my own eyes that those who live thus never lack, not because miracles fall from heaven, but because they have become the miracle. They live as part of the order that others only pray to find. They have learned that peace is not the absence of problem, but the absence of division, the single eye, the still heart, the treasure stored not in vaults but in consciousness. That is the wealth that neither moth nor time can touch. Judge not, that you be not judged, he said, and the words struck through the silence like lightning through a still sky, for he was not merely speaking of fairness, but of the invisible law that binds all thought to its own return. I have seen in the records of the soul that judgment is not an act but a seed, and every seed reproduces after its kind. What you sow in secret becomes the atmosphere you must breathe. What you condemn in another will one day wear your face. The measure you use will be measured back to you. And thus the wise learn that criticism is self-prophecy. For in the divine order nothing is ever truly directed outward. All things revolve inward again. He spoke of the man who sees a speck in his brother's eye but does not notice the beam in his own. And as he spoke, I saw the image unfold before me. For the beam is pride, the blindness of self-righteousness, the mind that mistakes its opinions for light, and the speck is merely a reflection of what one refuses to acknowledge within, for the world is the mirror of consciousness. And whoever tries to correct another before cleansing himself will only multiply blindness. He said, first remove the beam from your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's, meaning that compassion must precede correction, and clarity must come before counsel, for only the heart purified of ego can truly discern. Only the eyes washed in humility can perceive truth without distortion. I tell you this, the law of the Spirit operates with perfect symmetry. No thought leaves your mind without returning to your experience, and no word passes your lips without echoing in the chambers of your own soul. You may curse in secret, but you cannot hide from the vibration you create. It will find you again, closed as circumstance. That is why he warned, judge not to protect others, but to free you from the snare of projection. And he added a saying that few understood, do not give what is holy to dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them and turn again to tear you. And I beheld its meaning in vision, for the dogs are those instincts within man that feed upon refuse, the lower appetites of nature, and the swine are the unpurified emotions that wallow in self-pity and anger. And when you offer sacred truth to unready hearts, whether in others or in yourself, it is wasted, and worse, it is desecrated. For the holy cannot dwell where there is no reverence. Thus he taught discernment, not secrecy but wisdom. That light must be given in measure to the eye that can bear it, for even the sun blinds when it rises too quickly. And so too the mysteries of God must unfold in rhythm with the readiness of the soul. Then he said, "Ask and it shall be given. Seek and you shall find. Knock and it shall be opened." And I knew this was not permission to beg, but instruction in participation, for the universe is responsive. Every call evokes its own answer, but only the sincere call reaches the throne of law. To ask is to recognize need, to seek is to align direction, to knock is to take action, and all three must be joined before the gate opens. He said, "Everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it shall be opened." And I have seen this in the unseen worlds, where thought is substance and faith is force, for there the asking becomes vibration, the seeking becomes magnetism, and the knocking becomes manifestation. Yet many ask with divided hearts, seeking one thing and fearing another, and thus the gate remains shut, not by denial, but by dissonance. The Father gives good gifts. He said, "And no serpent to the child who asks for bread," meaning that divine supply never withholds, but the mind clouded by fear cannot recognize what it is given. Grace falls like rain upon the earth, but only the open field receives it. And then he spoke the law that gathers all others: "Whatever you wish men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets." And in that single rule he united heaven and earth, for the entire moral code of the universe rests upon reciprocity, the hidden geometry of empathy. Every act toward another is a letter addressed to the self. Every kindness builds your own dwelling. Every cruelty tears your own foundation. Thus righteousness is not commandment, but common sense at the level of the soul. And I say this as one who has read the records of many lives. In each I saw that the one who learned mercy early walked with light, and the one who clung to judgment walked in circles of shadow until he forgave. For forgiveness is the dissolving of illusion. It restores sight to the blind heart. It releases the prisoner and finds the door open on both sides. Yet he did not stop there. He lifted his hand toward the horizon and said, "Enter by the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the way that leads to life, and few find it." And as he spoke, the vision came upon me. The wide way was glittering with pleasure and noise, lined with mirrors reflecting every desire. It required no effort, only momentum. It was the road of the unexamined soul, the path of those who live by appetite and opinion. But its end was exhaustion, for it spiraled into itself like a serpent swallowing its own tail. The narrow way was steep and quiet, shaded by silence, and at first it appeared lonely. But as I walked it in vision, I found it crowded with angels unseen by the fleshly eye. Every step stripped away illusion. Every stone was an invitation to surrender. And I understood that the narrowness was not cruelty, but precision. For truth is exact. It demands that no excess be carried. You cannot enter burdened with pride, resentment, or greed. You must shed all that is not real to fit through the gate of reality. And he said, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." And I saw that these were not merely men, but thoughts, seductive half-truths, clothed in reason, yet feeding on fear. They speak softly, but sow separation. And he said, "By their fruits you shall know them. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor a bad tree good fruit," meaning that motive will always reveal itself in outcome. For the law of likeness cannot be broken. If a teaching leads to pride, domination, or despair, it is false. If it leads to humility, service, and peace, it is true. The world, even now, is filled with prophets of sensation who promise freedom but deliver addiction. They offer shortcuts to enlightenment, but leave the soul empty. For there is no truth that bypasses transformation. There is no heaven without obedience to law. Every tree that bears not good fruit is cut down and cast into the fire. And that fire is not vengeance, but purification. For the chaff must burn, so that the wheat may be gathered. And I say to you, test every spirit, weigh every word, even mine, by the fruit it produces in your heart. If it leads you closer to love, it is of God. If it leads you to scorn or superiority, cast it away. For the kingdom is not found in the noise of prophets, but in the stillness where discernment whispers. And when he had finished speaking, the mountain air trembled with quiet, for those who heard knew that the law of the soul had been unveiled, that every act of judgment, every request, every path walked, and every truth discerned would return to them multiplied. And I saw written in light the eternal principle: as you measure, so it shall be measured to you. As you seek, so you shall find. As you give, so you shall receive. As you judge, so you shall become. And I fell silent, for in that moment I knew that the sermon was not history, but the blueprint of being, the voice of eternal consciousness speaking through the mouth of a man to remind creation of its source. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them, he said, is like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, but it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these words and does not do them is like a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. These were his closing words, and they contained the whole sermon in seed form. For the difference between the wise and the foolish was not in hearing but in doing, not in knowledge but in embodiment. I have seen in the records of the soul that every truth unpracticed becomes sand, and every truth lived becomes stone. Many admire the light yet walk in darkness because they love the idea of truth more than its discipline. They applaud sermons but avoid transformation. They build philosophies without foundations. They speak of love but practice division. They know Scripture but not surrender. And when the storms come, their structures of belief collapse, for no life can stand upon words alone. It must be anchored in realization. He was not speaking of literal storms, but of the tempests of existence, the griefs, the betrayals, the losses, the moments when all that is external is stripped away, and only what is internal remains. In those hours, the foundation reveals itself. Religion built on ritual falls. Faith built on emotion falters. But the soul built on obedience endures. The rock is not doctrine, it is consciousness. The awareness that God is the ground of being, the silent strength beneath the changing surface. And to build upon it is to align one's will with that eternal law. He was calling the crowd not to admiration, but to alignment, not to applause, but to anchoring. For the truth cannot shelter you unless it inhabits you. I tell you this, every storm is a teacher disguised as chaos. Every flood is an invitation to return to foundation. The winds that strike, you are not enemies, but architects. They test what you have built and reveal what must be rebuilt. The wise man welcomes the rain because it proves his work. The foolish man curses it because it exposes his illusion. Yet both are offered mercy, for even collapse is a form of grace. When your house falls, you discover the ground again, the ground you ignored while you were building walls. This is the mercy of destruction, to return you to what endures. He said, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father. And many will say in that day, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons and perform miracles? And I will say to them, I never knew you. Depart from me. And these words reveal the most terrible truth of all, that outward success in the spiritual life can still conceal inward separation, that one can speak of God and not know him, perform in his name and not embody his nature. For the kingdom is not gained by activity but by authenticity. And I saw that this warning was given not to the sinner but to the pious, the ones most certain of their holiness, the ones whose prayers were loud but whose hearts were cold. For self-deception is the last veil before awakening. They knew the language of heaven but not its rhythm. They built temples upon sand and called them altars. They mistook power for presence, performance for purity. He was calling them to examine not their deeds but their source. The will of the Father is not a list of tasks but a state of being. To do his will is to be transparent to his nature, to love as he loves, to forgive as he forgives, to give as he gives, without calculation, without condition, without fear. The soul that lives thus has already entered the kingdom even while on earth. For heaven is not a place reached after death, but a dimension revealed by obedience. It begins wherever alignment begins. When the outer man yields to the inner law, then the house stands firm, though the floods rise. I tell you this, the storms of life are not punishment, they are purification. They strip away false supports until only the true remains. Every attachment shaken loose reveals the unshakable beneath. Every loss that feels like death is a resurrection in disguise. For what dies in the storm is what could never endure eternity, but what remains afterward is immortal. That is why the wise build quietly, unseen, beneath the surface. They spend years in prayer and silence, shaping foundations no one applauds. They are not impressive from afar. But when the storm comes, they are still standing. They are the hidden pillars of the world. And if you listen carefully, you can feel the peace of their stability, even in chaos. The foolish, however, build loudly upon applause and appearance. They decorate their walls and call it faith, but no decoration can save a structure built on pretense. For sand is always shifting. Its loyalty belongs to the wind. And when time tests it, nothing remains but fragments of noise. I have seen both kinds in the records of souls, the builder who used truth as ornament and the one who used silence as stone. The first gained admiration for a moment, the second gained eternity. And when death came, it was not an end, but a revelation, showing who had built upon self and who upon spirit. And I tell you this again, the storm is impartial. It visits every house. Faith is not the avoidance of trial, but endurance within it. The difference between collapse and stability is not luck, but foundation, and that foundation is built daily, in choices unseen, in forgiveness unspoken, in integrity when no one watches, in prayer whispered in darkness, in the quiet decision to trust when everything trembles. Those are the stones of the kingdom, invisible yet eternal. And when the flood of fear rises, when the wind of loss howls, when the rain of disappointment falls, the house built on such stones will not shake. It will stand not because it resists, but because it rests upon reality, the rock beneath all illusion, the Christ within all consciousness. And in that stillness, the wise man hears the echo of the Master's voice saying, "Be not afraid." The storm only proves the foundation, for the rain may fall and the winds may rage, but truth does not drown, love does not break, and the soul built on obedience becomes the mountain itself, unmoved, unshaken, eternal. When he had finished speaking, the silence that followed was not emptiness but awe, for the crowd had never heard a man speak as he did, not as a scholar quoting the dead, but as one who commanded the living. They were accustomed to teachers who built their authority on the words of others, but this man spoke as the origin of truth itself, as if the mountain, the sky, and the soul of every listener were his text, and every word struck not the ear but the heart. I saw it then, and I see it still, that the difference between his teaching and all others was not cleverness but presence. He did not explain the kingdom, he emanated it. Every sentence was a doorway, every image a mirror, and the people stood between wonder and fear, for they sensed that what he offered was not information but transformation, and transformation always demands death, the death of the false self, the death of the familiar comfort of ignorance. They had come expecting instruction, they found invitation, an open gate into another order of being, and some turned away because the cost was too high, but others stayed trembling, knowing that to hear such words was already to be changed. And I tell you this, the Sermon on the Mount was not a speech, it was an unveiling, the revelation of the law behind all laws, the vibration through which creation itself is tuned. Blessed are the poor in spirit was not sentiment. It was a statement of cosmic equilibrium, for only the empty can receive fullness, and blessed are the meek was not moral advice, but metaphysical fact. For only those who surrender control align with divine will. Every beatitude was a key, each unlocking a layer of illusion until the listener saw that heaven was not elsewhere but here, hidden in plain sight. waiting for eyes that see. He redefined power as purity, wealth as willingness, strength as surrender, and every value of the world was reversed. For in his vision the first were last and the last were first, not by punishment but by natural order, because pride is too heavy to rise and humility is lighter than air. And I understood why they said afterward that he spoke with authority. For authority is not position but origin. It is the voice of truth recognizing itself. When he said, "I have not come to abolish the law but to fulfill it," he was not amending religion but completing reality. The scaffolding of commandments gave way to the structure of consciousness. The external stone became living flesh. The written rule became the beating heart of grace. And from that moment, the age of fear began to end. Though it would take centuries for humanity to notice, he had declared the end of the contract model of religion, the trade between sacrifice and favor, and replaced it with a covenant of participation. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. He said, not as a demand, but as revelation, the mirror of divine possibility within man, and those who understood wept, for perfection was no longer unreachable. It was already implanted within, waiting to awaken. This was the revolution of his teaching, not rebellion against the old, but revelation of the eternal, and I have seen its ripple through time. Kingdoms have risen and fallen, empires have crumbled into dust, but those words still breathe, still pierce, still call, because they are not bound to history. They are the blueprint of soul architecture, and every century that tries to forget them rediscovers them in its ruin. He taught not theology, but alignment, not belief, but being, not ritual, but realization. The law fulfilled is the human spirit remembering its source, and this is why his sermon still divides the world. For it cannot be admired without being obeyed. It cannot be recited without being lived. It calls every listener to the crossroad of imitation or indifference. Those who admire him from afar remain spectators. Those who obey become extensions of his life. He said, "You are the light of the world," and that statement transferred the responsibility of radiance to us. The divine flame passed from his heart into ours, and the age of dependence ended. Now every soul must become a lamp or remain in darkness, and I have seen that most prefer to admire the light rather than become it. For to shine is to burn, to illuminate is to surrender fuel, but that is the way of the kingdom. Nothing is kept except by being given, and every light that hides itself dies. This was the paradox he taught, the wisdom that still confounds the intellect, that loss is gain, that weakness is strength, that dying is living, and that heaven begins where the self ends. Those who heard him sensed the danger in his words, for they dismantled every hierarchy, exposed every hypocrisy, and dissolved every illusion of control. No temple, no nation, no system could contain such a king, for it was not built with hands, but awakened within hearts. Though he stood on a hill, he was not founding a religion. He was declaring the architecture of reality, showing what has always been true, that God is not reached by climbing, but revealed by clearing. The veil is not in heaven, but in perception. And when the mind stills, the kingdom appears. He ended with the image of two builders, and in that final parable he summarized the fate of every soul. The one who hears and obeys builds on rock. The one who hears and forgets builds on sand. And that rock was himself, the eternal word beneath the shifting forms of time. All who build upon him endure the storms, for he is not a concept but a foundation, not an idea to believe but a being to become. This is why the crowd was astonished, for they recognized in him the sound of something older than speech, the echo of the first fiat of creation, "Let there be light." And I knew then, as I know now, that his words were not addressed to that generation alone. They were spoken to the root of humanity, to the collective soul that still stumbles between fear and freedom. The Sermon on the Mount remains the voice that calls the sleeping world awake. It is the law of consciousness clothed in human language, the eternal blueprint for rebuilding the inner temple. And every time it is heard with understanding, the mountain rises again, the crowd gathers again, and the voice speaks again, not from history, but from within, saying the same truth it always has. The kingdom of God is within you. And until you find it there, you will search the earth in vain. But the moment you see it, all else falls into place, and the storm, the hunger, the grief, and the striving lose their power, for the rock has been found. The house stands, the light shines, and the silence at the end is not the absence of sound, but the completion of creation. I tell you plainly, the Sermon on the Mount was not a message spoken once upon a hill. It is the pattern of the soul's awakening, the manual of transformation that every spirit must rediscover in its own age. For those words were not written on stone or scroll, but on the vibration of life itself. And though men have built temples, doctrines, and systems upon them, the true temple is within. The true altar is the heart made pure by surrender. I have read in the Akashic record that every civilization rises or falls according to how closely it remembers or forgets this law. Whenever the inner law is kept, peace blooms like spring in the soul of nations. And whenever it is forgotten, chaos multiplies, greed devours, and even religion becomes idolatry. For there is no greater blasphemy than using the name of God to serve the ego. That is why his sermon begins with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," because only the emptied vessel can be refilled with truth. The full heart cannot receive, the proud mind cannot hear, and the violent will cannot rest. Each beatitude is a rung on the ladder from illusion to illumination. First the breaking, then the morning, then the meekness that allows the soul to yield, then the hunger for righteousness that draws light into being, then the mercy that dissolves resentment, then the purity that clarifies sight, then the peacemaking that mirrors heaven, until at last the persecution that tests it all and proves whether faith is built on God or approval. I have seen in vision that the sermon is not philosophy, it is anatomy. The anatomy of divine life growing within human form, and every teaching that follows is a pulse of that same current. To love enemies is to dissolve the polarity that divides creation. To pray in secret is to return the voice to its source. To forgive is to open the circulatory system of heaven so that grace may flow unblocked. To store treasures in heaven is to align consciousness with permanence rather than decay. To seek first the kingdom is to let purpose govern provision. To refrain from judgment is to cleanse perception. To ask, seek, and knock is to awaken the magnetic field of divine correspondence. And to build upon the rock is to embody these truths until they are not belief but being. This is why he said, "Whoever hears and does these things, not whoever agrees, but whoever acts. For knowledge unused decays into pride, but truth lived expands into wisdom." And I say this as one who has witnessed the tragedy of many lives. Souls who memorized scripture yet never met God, who prayed aloud but never listened, who fasted outwardly but fed the ego inwardly, who preached peace while harboring hatred. They built their houses on sand and called them churches. But the storm always comes, not as punishment but revelation. The Sermon on the Mount is the storm in words, for it overturns false foundations. It exposes what cannot last, and it reveals what cannot die. Blessed are those who let it break them, for they will discover the unbreakable, the kingdom of heaven within. I tell you this, the sermon is not moral code. It is metaphysical correction. It reorders the axis of consciousness from self to source, from grasping to giving, from appearance to essence. And once that axis is restored, everything else aligns by law. You cannot serve two masters, because there is only one center, and every divided loyalty tears the soul in two. The narrow way he spoke of is not narrow by exclusion, but by focus. For truth is singular, while error is infinite. The gate is straight, because reality has no detour. It demands the surrender of every false identity, every pretense, every possession mistaken for power, and every fear mistaken for wisdom. I have seen in the etheric record that those who walk this path often feel stripped bare, for the kingdom is not added to you. It is revealed as what you already are once the coverings fall away. That is why he said, "The pure in heart shall see God," not because God hides, but because impurity blinds. The kingdom is not distant, only the eyes are dim. When the heart is clear, everything becomes transparent. Even sorrow glows with meaning. Even pain becomes prayer. And even death becomes a door. This is the law that governs all transformation. As within, so without. Whatever you judge in others mirrors what you refuse to face in yourself. Whatever you give returns multiplied. Whatever you fear attracts its likeness. And whatever you surrender releases its hold. He was not giving advice. He was describing the structure of consciousness, the circuitry through which divine energy flows. To ignore it is to suffer. To live by it is to awaken. And though the world still resists this simplicity, still worships power, wealth, and fame, the sermon waits in silence, patient as the law of gravity, unmoved by disbelief, for eternity needs no defenders. It needs only witnesses, and every age produces them, souls who live the sermon rather than quote it, who bless when cursed, who forgive without memory, who give without counting, who see God in the beggar and the enemy alike, and through them the world remembers again, for they become living mountains where heaven and earth meet. I tell you, even now the words still vibrate in the air of that hill above Galilee. They never ended, they never faded, for every truth once spoken from the heart of God becomes eternal resonance, and all who still the noise within themselves can hear it, not as history but as heartbeat, saying love, forgive, trust, become, build on the rock, not on appearance, for only what is real can endure. The wind of time will strip away all else, but the kingdom remains, not future but now, not above but within. And blessed is the soul that hears and answers, for it has found what prophets longed to see and kings could not purchase, the peace that passes understanding, the treasure that rust cannot touch, the light that darkness cannot comprehend, the law fulfilled not by command but by consciousness, the mountain that still speaks, the voice that still calls, the kingdom that still waits in the heart of every man. The sermon does not end when the voice falls silent. It continues wherever a heart remembers. For truth once awakened never sleeps again, and I have seen in the records of spirit that every generation must climb its own mountain to hear the same words anew. For though the language of men changes, the law of consciousness does not. What was spoken in Galilee is spoken still in the chambers of every soul. The call to inner kingdom, the demand for sincerity, the discipline of love. He spoke not to the ears of his time, but to the root of human being, and the echo reaches still. The crowds that gathered then were no different from us now. They feared poverty, desired security, sought recognition, and trembled before uncertainty. And so he addressed not an ancient culture, but the eternal human condition. When he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he spoke to the one who has been stripped of illusions. When he said, "Love your enemies," he addressed the one tormented by resentment. When he said, "Do not worry about tomorrow," he comforted the one imprisoned by anxiety. And when he said, "Build upon the rock," he warned the one who builds upon applause. The Sermon on the Mount remains the mirror of humanity's divided mind. It exposes hypocrisy not to condemn, but to heal. It dismantles false religion so that true communion may rise. For religion without spirit becomes idolatry, and knowledge without humility becomes poison. That is why every age has misunderstood him. Some turned his words into law again. Others diluted them into metaphor. Few lived them as instruction. Yet each who has truly obeyed has become light to his age, whether known or nameless, for divine truth needs no fame. Its proof is transformation. Its authority is fruit. I tell you this, the sermon is not moral advice, but metaphysical alignment. It restores the original harmony between creator and creation, between consciousness and form, between heaven and earth. Its aim is not to make you good, but to make you whole, to reveal that goodness is wholeness seen from the inside, and wholeness is union with the source. This is why its first word is blessed, for blessing is not reward, but recognition, the acknowledgement of divine pattern already present beneath the surface chaos of life. The pure in heart are not those who never err, but those whose intention remains clear. The peacemakers are not diplomats, but mirrors of equilibrium. They carry within them the calm of the unshakable, for they have ceased to divide what God has joined, the outer and the inner, the sacred and the common, the visible and the unseen, all are facets of one truth. To live this way is to awaken Eden again, not in myth but in consciousness. And yet the path is narrow, for it asks the death of self, and the self resists extinction with every breath. It clings to comparison, to possession, to pride. It prefers theology to transformation, because ideas cost less than surrender. But the law of spirit cannot be tricked. Whatever is not yielded will eventually be taken, not in wrath but in mercy, for only the empty can be filled. And so the wise learn to empty themselves willingly through giving, forgiving, fasting, and prayer. Each act a subtraction that multiplies awareness. He called it losing life to find it. For what dies is illusion, and what remains is eternal. The sermon demands not effort but openness, not perfection but presence. The perfection he spoke of is not moral flawlessness, but unity of vision, the single eye that sees God in all, the awareness that dissolves division, and in that awareness righteousness becomes natural, obedience becomes joy, love becomes law. This is the fulfillment. He proclaimed not a new religion, but a new reality. The law written on the heart rather than stone. The temple rebuilt not in Jerusalem, but in consciousness. And I tell you, until this is realized, humanity will keep circling the same wilderness, building towers that collapse, writing creeds that contradict, and searching for heaven while standing upon it. The sermon is the antidote to all such wandering. It calls the soul back to simplicity, to the straightness of being true, to the poverty that owns nothing yet lacks nothing, to the quiet that hears God in the wind and in the wound. It is not a ladder to climb, but a mirror to stand within, reflecting what has always been, that the kingdom is within you, not hidden by distance, but by distraction. The storm that destroys the house on sand is the mercy that reveals the rock beneath. The persecution that strips away reputation is the grace that exposes essence. The hunger for righteousness is the appetite of the divine remembering itself, and the meekness that yields is the strength that cannot break. Every paradox in his words is a door, for the mind that tries to understand will stumble, but the heart that lives them will see. And I have seen that each teaching of the sermon corresponds to a level of soul evolution. It begins with awakening and ends with embodiment. It starts with dependence and ends with dominion. It begins in poverty and ends in peace. And every soul that walks this arc fulfills the purpose of incarnation, to manifest the unseen within the seen, to let heaven invade matter through consciousness. And so the sermon is not a moral summit to admire from afar. It is a road to walk daily, one breath, one act, one forgiveness at a time, until your being itself becomes the message, your presence becomes the sermon, your silence becomes the mount. And the same voice that once spoke from Galilee now speaks through you, saying again to the world, you are the light, you are the salt, you are the city set on a hill. Do not hide, do not fear, for the kingdom is nearer than thought, closer than breath. And when you live from that knowing, every moment becomes sacred, every act becomes worship, and every storm becomes peace. This is the completion of his teaching. That divinity is not beyond reach, but already within reach, not to be earned but remembered, not to be sought through effort but revealed through surrender. And whoever understands this, even dimly, has fulfilled the law, for he has seen that heaven and earth are one.